Hereby I open this academic ceremony at Maastricht University. First of all, I'd like to welcome our candidate of today, Gavin van der Nest, and he will defend his thesis in public, and the thesis is called Hidden Depth, Robustness of Modeling Approaches for Uncovering Latent Classes in Longitudinal Data. I would like to welcome all the members of the degree committee, not only present here, but also present online, as you can see on the screen. And now I would like to introduce the four supervisors. Professor Gerard van Breukelen, he is Professor of Methodology and Statistics of Maastricht University. Dr. Matt Kandel, he is Associate Professor of Methodology and Statistics also of Maastricht University. And Dr. Valeria Lima Passos, Assistant Professor of Methodology and Statistics and Lecturer in Biostatistics, and she is affiliated with Maastricht University and the Royal College of Surgeons in Dublin, Ireland. The six opponents I will introduce to you later during the ceremony, because when I mention all those names now at one time, you will certainly forget them. So I'll do that later. And I would like to welcome you here present in the aula, and I would also like to welcome all the followers of the live stream. Mr. van der Nest, may I ask you to give a summary of your thesis? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Good afternoon, Pro-Rector, highly esteemed opponents, friends, family, colleagues. Today I will walk you through a 15-minute presentation, hopefully, of my thesis entitled Hidden Depths, Robustness of Modeling Approaches for Uncovering Latent Classes in Longitudinal Data. At the end of this 15-minute presentation, I hope that this title will make a little bit more sense to you all. So, my first question that I would like to pose to you is to ask, what is latent or hidden classes of subjects showing similar changes over time? This is quite a mouthful. Well, let us step back and think about data that we might have. Let us consider the total cholesterol level of individuals. Here we have a selection of patients looking at their measurement of total cholesterol over time. To the naked eye, you see a mass of chaos in this data, and patterns are not easily and clearly distinguishable. The point of these models that I'll be introducing you to is to somehow make sense out of this chaos. And in this sense, these are a statistical model, a model-based clustering technique, where we can reduce the chaos in the data that we see there and have something useful at the end of the day. What we have just seen, where we reduce the chaos to specific latent classes. In this case, the model has shown us 4 distinct classes of development over time, referring to cholesterol. Here we see that, in most applications of these data models, authors at the end of the day give names to the specific classes. So here we see a chronic class of cholesterol, where people have high cholesterol and it stays high over time. We then see individuals who have high cholesterol and improve over time, which is the optimal condition, I would say. Those who have delayed onset, where you first have low cholesterol, which then increases over time, and perhaps the optimal group that we would preferably all like to belong to is having low cholesterol, which stays low over time. And each of these groups has an average trajectory, where we have a certain probabilistic assignment of individuals belonging into these groups. So now the utility of longitudinal finite mixture models. Why are these models useful? Why would we apply them? Well, they have been growing in application in the past decade, and just looking at a random selection of studies which have just been done in the past 2 years, we can see the wide field of application of these models. A first example is looking at behavioral studies, where we can find trajectories of eating behavior of changes during adolescence. The second one is mental health, which I'm sure we can all relate to during the COVID-19 pandemic. The second one is medical sciences, where we can consider the evaluation of alcohol intake throughout adulthood and the colorectal cancer risk. Further, they have been applied in insurance medicine studies, life course studies, as well as agriculture and agricultural sustainability, particularly in the European Union. And finally, as a final example, even in financial decision making. So perhaps this can help us all during this time of inflation, perhaps. Okay, now looking at the outline of my thesis, once we've had this brief introduction, I will speak us through the different motivations and the parts of my thesis. Well, the first study that we conducted was motivated by the situation in which there's a lot of confusion in literature about these models and how they can be applied and what their usefulness is. So what we tried to do was to increase the accessibility and understanding of these longitudinal finite mixture models, particularly for practitioners, to be able to be used in their own research. As such, using this as the basis, we moved to our second study, where we tried to develop tools to help with the tricky choice of model selection and indeed choosing the correct number of classes. But I say correct quite lightly in that aspect, but we'll get to it a little bit later. Then we considered whether we should model outcomes separately or simultaneously. And when I mean separately, we could consider the total cholesterol over time, or perhaps we've measured other outcomes too, so like blood pressure or insulin levels. And we specifically asked the question which would be better under what situations, and why there would be differences between the two modeling approaches. Finally, we considered model selection when simultaneously examining these multiple outcomes. And the final part of my presentation today will just be the main conclusions of this thesis. So the first study, as I said, was motivated by the fact that there's a morass of models out there, of these longitudinal finite mixture models. They come by a lot of names, and because they are so freely available, people aren't exactly sure under which circumstances and what the model assumptions are. And in order to have good science, it's quite important that you understand the models you are applying. So in this sense, we try to make sense out of the chaos out there, to provide clear and an unambiguous definition of popular models, to show their commonalities and the interrelatedness between these models. So this is a diagram directly out of the thesis where we showed the model commonalities and the interrelatedness between them. And yeah, it's important to distinguish between latent classes, models where there's only one latent class, and in this case, these models require an additional grouping variable, a known grouping variable such as sex, to be able to examine differences between subgroups within our sample. The second part, the longitudinal finite mixture models, which is the focus of this thesis, includes more than one latent class. And in these type of models, you do not need a grouping variable, just the outcome characteristics themselves is enough to be able to distinguish differences between subjects and classes. However, choosing the number of these unknown classes is difficult. It is a tricky and one would also say quixotic quest, and very challenging. But fortunately, there are some statistical fit indices which can assist us in informing what the number of classes should be. And as such, in our first paper, we provided an extensive overview of fit statistics, which can assist us in choosing the number of classes, but importantly, also the drawbacks, the commonalities of these statistics, and perhaps under which situations it's best to apply them. Further, we provided an inventory of various statistical software available for modeling, which is important because in many cases, software is not freely available, and most people are perhaps only familiar with one type of software. So we try to get this out there. Further, using this information, we use this to inform a modeling strategy, which provided some guidance for model selection when fitting longitudinal finite mixture models. And the specific focus of this was, or motivation for this, was so that it could be practitioner friendly. And after this total study, we used this to motivate our further second, third, and fourth paper, in which it helped us to inform simulation conditions under which we should investigate, modeling specifications to consider, as well as other practical issues that researchers might face in their own research. Right. Okay. So now, given the tricky choice of class selection, what is the true number of classes? There is unfortunately no one-size-fits-all approach to selecting the number of classes. In many cases, also, if you use a too restrictive model, and when I mean too restrictive, it's the case in which you assume that individuals within a class all follow the same similar trajectory over time, and any differences between these individuals is just random noise or error. And in this specific case, when you use too restrictive of a model, more classes are needed to capture this heterogeneity, which you are not accounting for in these specific models. Secondly, if you use too general a model, and in this case, you can imagine this is the red distribution which I use to account for the too restrictive model, but one can imagine that this red distribution is then decomposed into an additional component where we account for variation or variability between subjects within a specific class. But the problem with this is, if it's too general, you might be modeling variability upon variability, and in this sense, you might be fitting too complex a model where complexity actually does not exist. And in this specific model, a concern is that you could get empty classes and non-valid results. So it's a bit of a balance between them, and we have to try and find the middle ground. Well, finally, we developed a diagnostic tool which basically considered the behavior of the fit statistic curve as the number of fitted classes increased. I'll show you this diagram over here. Here you can see that there is, for example, first, with a too restrictive model, this is in the case where you assume that all individuals in the class follow the same development profile, and any difference is just random error. We see this is represented in the blue curve. Here, there is a plateauing behavior, and we see a continual improvement in the fit statistic as the number of fitted classes increase. For a just right model, which I like to call, we see a quick improvement and a U-shaped fit curve, and this is represented by the black line over here. And if you use too general a model, it's also often U-shaped and mimics the just right model in many instances, but a too general model is not always a silver bullet, unfortunately, because in this case, you might have under-extraction of classes, and you could possibly lose clinically meaningful classes during the extraction process. Using this as a background, we then wondered about modeling outcomes separately or simultaneously. And this was motivated by the background that there's an increasing availability of data collected simultaneously on multiple outcomes. So an example of this, which I referred to before, is when you can measure cholesterol levels of individuals, but at the same time, you could also measure blood pressure, insulin levels, any type of medical records at that specific time. So our question was then, would it make sense to model the outcomes separately, one at a time, or simultaneously, where we can consider all the outcomes collected at the same time? And specifically, we see that there were some differences or discordance between the methods. And we wanted to investigate the drivers of this discordance and concordance, so sometimes they did actually agree in many aspects, specifically in the terms of the class recovery between the two different modeling approaches. And what I mean here about concordance and discordance, I think is best illustrated with an example. So as we can see here now, at the top row, this is when we're considering separately modeling our outcomes. At the bottom row, this is the simultaneous modeling of the two outcomes together. Looking between the two outcomes, well, the first outcome, we see a lot of concordance or agreement in the trajectory profiles between the two modeling approaches. This is also the same for the second outcome, in which we see much concordance between the trajectory profiles. A different example here, we see that there is a lot of concordance in the first outcome in the separate modeling versus the simultaneous modeling, where a lot of the trajectory profiles and class sizes agree in some manner with each other. But in the second outcome, we see quite a large difference in the trajectories which are extracted. And our question was, why do we see such patterns in data, in the modeling process? So what we generally could conclude was that the stronger the cross-class assignment, and what I mean by that is that individuals throughout outcomes were mostly assigned to the same class, there was a greater concordance between the separate and the simultaneous modeling approaches. However, differences in how close the classes are in specific outcomes led to some interesting results. What we saw here and now is if you had a high separated outcome in which the classes were further apart and another low separated outcome in which they were closer together, the high separated outcome tended to distort the low separated outcome with the closer classes, in the sense that the trajectory profiles were distorted from what the true profiles were expected to be. And in general, simultaneous modeling was better able to recover classes, even when classes were much closer together, in the sense of low class separation. And these observations, amongst others, informed a modeling strategy which we have presented for practitioners in this chapter. Finally, we looked at the model selection when simultaneously examining multiple outcomes. And in this case, we generalized the simultaneous model to the understudied effects of allowing for realizations of each outcome at each time point to be related to their previous realizations. This is quite a bit of a mouthful, so I think it's best to illustrate this visually. So as you can imagine, just imagine alcohol consumption over time. And in the first instance, the second time point, the second record of alcohol consumption is somehow related to the first record, and this is over time that each one is related to a previous realization of the outcome. And in the second outcome, the same occurs, where the where the realization at time point t+1 is somehow dependent on what the realization in time point t was. And during this investigation, we have shown that not fully accounting for these dynamics between realizations of outcomes in terms of the time dependency does lead to poor trajectory recovery and classification performance. However, the more general model performs almost on par with the correct model, and as such, I would argue that a general model is a good place to start. However, generalizability is software dependent. And if one is not able to generalize, then if you were to fit a fit statistic curve and you see it continually improving as the number of fitted classes improve, I would take this as a cautionary signal, step back a little bit and examine your model in greater detail. And the main conclusions of this thesis, as I've mentioned before, and it's very important to note, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to model selection. It's a balance between pragmatism, statistical theory, and logic, I would argue. Fit statistics provide some statistical rigor for the model selection process, but remain also to some extent heuristic. But if we see a plateauing fit statistic, one might think that it's too restrictive a model that we are applying to our data, and in that case it might be a good idea to loosen these restrictions and generalize your model. The more general models, however, tend to perform on par with the correct models, but as I mentioned before, it's not always a silver bullet, as we can introduce complexity upon complexity, and especially with the simultaneous modeling models, tended to struggle to converge to a solution with this additional complexity. Also, classes being much closer together in our data generally leads to poor class recovery, because the models struggle to distinguish between the different classes. And in terms of single outcome and simultaneous outcome modeling, the differences and similarities between these approaches is driven by the strength of the cross-class assignment, the closeness of classes within outcomes, and a large dominant class. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by the chair of the Thesis Assessment Committee, and she's also secretary of this committee, Professor Zwakhale, and she's professor of nursing science at Maastricht University. Professor Zwakhale.
Dear candidates, many thanks for your insights and congratulations to you, but also to your supervision team with this thesis. Well readable, structured, and challenging. You describe well the considerations, and as well in the presentation, I think, again, that need to be taken into account to conduct solid research in health specifically. In how to identify the correct model, to identify differences in, for example, treatment responses over time, or to evaluate individual variation in responses to interventions. You mentioned all these considerations and issues to be aware of when conducting these analyses to really conduct good research. And reading your thesis, and again a bit in this presentation, it made me a bit anxious because I thought, well, so many considerations to take into account. You also mentioned the words like tricky, hidden depths, so I was always aware of the fact, are we doing the right things? So that made me a bit worrisome in a way. And therefore, I would like to elaborate a bit more with you about the challenges that I experience in conducting applied science, as I have a background in nursing. And I think one of the things that characterize our research is the amount of uncertainties in these complex interventions that we conduct. And I really liked your connection with health, and especially with the examples that you used in your thesis. And when I read chapter 5, you mentioned these UK data on quality of life and dementia care, and these outcomes on agitation and quality of life. And I could really imagine that they were almost our data, because these are the data that we have on a daily basis, conducting longitudinal studies, clustered randomized trials, on many outcomes in heterogeneous populations in different contexts with so many uncertainties. On page 144, and I quote, replications of the chosen models, as you refer to, should be confirmed as through cross-validation. That is what you mentioned. And while reading this, I fully agree. But I also know from my own background how hard it is to replicate studies. We often do replications, complete same interventions in a different context, and then they might not work because they are influenced by this heterogeneity, by these all enormous amount of latent variables that you are not aware of. And I just wonder, can I have, please, your reflection on what could be possible solutions in case of these enormous variations and heterogeneity in these studies of applied science, which are often pragmatic trials? So first, I would like to...
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for your question and for your congratulations. Yes, this is always a consideration that one needs to be aware of. And I also appreciate the honesty where you have mentioned that you face a little bit of apprehension in using these models, and it's good to have a healthy skepticism and apprehension in using these models, because if you just blindly apply them, of course, you can go into dangerous territory. But
I don't dare apply any of them at all, but that's a different thing.
Yeah, well, then perhaps chapter 1 and 2 would be a nice chapter to perhaps go through and consider what, I hoped to make it more accessible, but I fully understand the apprehension. Yeah. Now, in terms of the replicability, this is also always a question of costs and time, and also the heterogeneity in the data, of course. So there are many ways that one can possibly think of replicating these studies or validating it in some way. So you don't necessarily have to replicate the study per se, but you could find some other highly correlated variables perhaps, or a distal outcome, which would give some certainty or some meaning to these classes which you find. Because the classes by themselves are pretty meaningless. You need to be able to link them to something to have substance to the classes. And unfortunately with my thesis, we focused more about extracting the classes and looking at model specification. But the validation of the classes, I would argue, is probably the most important step. And this is something that I definitely would love to go into further ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Elaborating a bit further on that, I had a different question, but now that you mentioned this, one of the things that I was thinking about, what would be next in this? Is this a validation, or what would be your next step?
Yeah, certainly to go more into the validation of these classes, because it is important that we can link it to something, to bring substance to these classes. Because at the moment, we could argue that just extracting the classes, they are quirks of the data, per se. And we need to have some type of usefulness of these classes. And the validation of those classes is the next natural step. And I know there's been some research, especially in criterion validity as an example, where we use genotyping, per se, to validate these classes, or also through meta-analysis, of course. So it's quite a field rich for picking, I would say. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I look at a small question. Well, building on that, I would be really curious about. As I mentioned, we have all these data, often from pragmatic trials. Sometimes it's like Swiss cheese. There are more holes than perfect data. So we have that more pragmatic information driven from practice. You have all this empirical, statistical, theoretical information. What would you recommend for both of us to optimize the research process and to really benefit both from it, for you to build more robust models that are more correct, and for us to improve the patient outcome? How could we meet in the middle? Just one advice.
Yeah, well, I think it's perhaps appropriate to mention one of my propositions, where I specifically spoke about that for statisticians, they can play in everybody's backyard, but it's important for them to at least have some understanding of that backyard that they're operating in. So statisticians should learn from the practitioners to gain a better understanding of their work, and we can be in a team partnership together to take these models forward. Okay. So we can learn from each other, essentially.
Okay, thank you. I think you proved that by performing your thesis.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zwakhalen. The next opponent is Professor Nagin. He is not here, but you can see him on the screen. He's Professor of Public Policy and Statistics, and he's affiliated with the Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, USA. Professor Nagin. Oh, he has...
First rate.
Okay.
This is really a first-rate piece of work, and you should take great pride in it. So my question to you actually builds off my own work on these kind of finite mixture models, which I call, in my own work, based trajectory models. And in that, my own work, I've emphasized from the outset that these groups are not real entities. They're actually meant to be approximations to some unknown distribution of trajectories, which is likely continuous, and but of unknown shape. And because of that, the reality is that there really is not a true number of groups. The purpose of the exercise is to identify the distinctive features of this distribution of unknown trajectories. But still, in my own work and your thesis is all about this, is some judgment has to be made about how many groups sort of best provides the best description or approximation of this unknown distribution. I've provided some advice about this, but this thesis goes well, goes into depth at that question. And so my question to you is, for the applied researchers, what advice would you give them based on your thesis? What are the 3 or 4 things that you would tell them to focus on in trying to decide not only on the number of trajectory groups to have, but also the order of the order of the polynomial that characterizes that one trajectory group?
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for your question and your kind words of congratulations. Yes, this is a very topical issue, and one can argue, of course, that, as you yourself has mentioned, that it is a quixotic quest in establishing the true number of classes. And we will never know what the true number of classes are, because unless we have perfect knowledge of the data generating process. And in this case, my advice to practitioners would be to be pragmatic, to be transparent about the modeling process, to provide their code that they specifically used, and each of the steps that they have undertaken. But that is that's just the broad aspect. What I would then say as well is to be, I just need a moment to collect my thoughts, sorry, because it is a very important question. Okay, yes, thank you. So as we've mentioned throughout this thesis, there's no one fit statistic which performs well, right? And in our case, when practitioners are dealing with the specific data through their model process, and what we've shown in our thesis specifically in choosing the correct number of classes, we can have some diagnostic tools to assist us, specifically the fit criteria curve, where we saw in this case that a continuous improvement and a plateauing behavior of the fit criteria curve is perhaps indicative of being too restrictive in your model. And we saw, and my argument would be then, why would we want to have more classes than are strictly necessary? Because it's, in my experience, it's all about minimizing and making the complex reality more tenable to, or tractable to individuals. Further, my thesis only dealt with the extraction of these classes, and specifically the number of classes and under the conditions where this could possibly go wrong or right. And a very important next step is the cross-validation, which we have spoken about before too. And in that sense, the classes have no meaning until they are validated with some type of either theoretical justification, linking to a distal outcome per se, or some type of genotyping, criterion validity, or replicability throughout data sets. But the problem there is, of course, the time constraints, the money constraints, and it is quite a difficult process to follow.
So let me follow up with you on that. I believe it's chapter 4 or 5. You compare single trajectory models with what I call multi-trajectory models, and the chapter ends with very nicely with a set of selections. I mean, a set of suggestions to practitioners of how they should decide between these two different types of models. And so, and that discussion, I think, is very well done. But my recollection is that you had like 17 different suggestions, which is a long list. So can you, of those, pick the 2 or 3 that you think are most important?
Firstly, the fit statistic criteria curve. I would argue that that is quite important to investigate. And then in terms of the polynomial order, it's also important that one investigates the spaghetti plot before you even start the modeling process. Exploratory data analysis is the first step in any type of analysis. And in that way, some type of visual representation there could inform what your polynomial order could possibly be, bearing in mind the constraints, the number of time points, and what the maximum polynomial for those time points would be. I would also argue that for the quality of the class extraction, specifically the overlap coefficient, looking at how close these classes are and whether they are meaningful constituents of your model. Finally, the Kramer's V is also quite a nice one, particularly when you're trying to decide between the number of classes in a multivariate, the multivariate GBTM, specifically the number of classes which you should fit. And looking at the Kramer's V, the strength of the cross-class associations, the stronger that cross-class association is, then one can argue that you would need fewer classes to somehow model the variability in the data appropriately.
Thank you. You've answered my questions. And again, I'll just end by saying this is a thesis that you should take great pride in.
Thank you very much, Professor Nagin. The next opponent is Professor Van der Schoot. He is Professor of Methodology and Statistics at Utrecht University, but he is also affiliated with Northwestern University in South Africa. Professor Van der Schoot.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. I first want to congratulate you with the excellent dissertation. I enjoyed reading all of your chapters, the technical part and the recommendations. I've also seen that one of your chapters has already received a lot of citations, which is really good. So you make an impression in the field and people are actually using your recommendations now. So congratulations. This is an impactful dissertation. I want to slowly move the discussion away from the practical guidelines to the more technical parts. And my questions are actually building the bridge between the practitioners and the statisticians, the technicians who are also interested in your work. I want to take you to the discussion section where you make some statements, for example, on page 165. Which is rather disappointing. You write, all fit statistics performed poorly. Oh no, so there's not one golden solution. Too bad, but this is something we already knew, and I'm happy to see that you also validated previous work. So nothing too new, I would say, because we already knew that there was not one golden fit index that worked for all situations, but I'm very happy to see that with your extensive simulation studies, you validated this statement. So thank you. Okay, I want to take you to the next page, 157, where you provide two sides of a dimension. On the one hand, you write on the top of the page about clinically meaningful classes that might be merged together in one single class. So the model is not good enough to distinguish substantive, meaningful classes. At the bottom of the page, you write the opposite, namely you say there might be classes that provide spurious results. Which of the two do you think is more problematic, or which of the two? So on the one hand, you want to avoid missing clinical relevant classes, and you also want to avoid having all these spurious classes. So first of all, which of the two is more important from your perspective, and what's technically the perfect balance between the two? So can you elaborate on this?
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for your questions and your congratulations. Yes, that is quite an interesting question. And as I've argued throughout the thesis, well, as humans, we like clear-cut answers. And there are, unfortunately, not always clear-cut answers. And in this case, well, it depends on whether you are perhaps a clinician interested in specifically identifying rare groups. And in this case, the collapsing of this rare group would be detrimental to your studies or to your future research, or perhaps even the health of an individual. So that per se is quite important. But with the spurious classes, so this is additional classes which aren't strictly necessary to account for the total variability. Perhaps in that sense, introducing spurious classes is less dangerous than the collapse of clinically meaningful classes.
So in your simulation studies, did you consider imbalanced classes, or were all of your simulations assuming balanced classes? So it might be, for example, that there is a highly imbalanced data generating mechanism where there's a small, clinically very meaningful class. Did you consider such a simulation?
Thank you, Professor. Yes, we did not actually consider that in the specific study, unfortunately, because of time constraints. But this is something that is definitely on the research agenda, and it is quite an important topic to consider. And that's specifically where, you know, genotyping and the criterion validity can play quite an important role in establishing these small classes that one might actually have missed.
So how do you think that your current results would be generalizable to the situation where you have imbalanced classes? Do you expect that the fit statistics would behave in a similar fashion?
Well, yes. So now that you mention it as well, when we considered the simulations between the univariate and the multivariate GBTM specifically, and the strength of the cross-class correlation or the conditional assignment, in that specific case, we did have some classes where there were 2% of individuals. And one can argue that that is a small, clinically meaningful class. And in that specific case, where we saw with the multivariate, that it also did struggle to pick up that small class, and in that sense, under-extracted. So perhaps what we've seen there, and although it wasn't the specific focus of this thesis, it definitely can provide a foundation for future research.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you also write in your discussion section is that adding more information to the model, more variables, a better covariance structure adds information to the model, making it easier to find the optimal number of classes in the trajectories, right?
What I did argue, yes. But what I can also say, and this is what we're also specifically looking at, is introducing how many multiple outcomes can you introduce to a model before the model starts to fail and just go completely apart. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it also relates to convergence issues, of course. I mean, the more variables you add, the more time points you add, the more covariates you add. You also need an increasing amount of data, which at some point is not realistic anymore. Do we have time for a second question?
For a short question, yes. For a short question.
Okay. So in your discussion section and already in a previous discussion, you referred to a meta-analysis. How would you actually do a meta-analysis with such exploratory results? Because all the models you describe in your paper are data-driven. A meta-analysis study in such a situation. I have no idea. So enlighten me.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Yeah, so...
And a short question needs a short answer, please.
Okay. Yes, it's very difficult and challenging to do so, but perhaps you could also think about Bayesian simulations and introducing that, where we've got our parameters from the models and running that through some type of simulation, I would, as a short answer, perhaps.
Bayesian as a short answer, I'm satisfied. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor van der Schoot. The next opponent is Dr. Unema. She is Associate Professor of Health Promotion at Maastricht University. Dr. Unema.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidates, I also would like to start with congratulating you and your supervisory team with this excellent dissertation. I have read your thesis with great pleasure, and I want to compliment you for the way in which you made highly complicated statistical matter accessible for non-statisticians. So I think that was really well done. In your thesis, you address an important statistical topic, but also one that is very relevant for practitioners. And your objective was to provide practitioners with best practice guidelines for handling multivariate latent trajectory models. And I think that you really succeeded in doing so. But of course, we're not here to only give compliments, but also to have some interesting discussion. And I also want to go back to the implications for practice, because I'm from the field of health promotion, more from the behavioral sciences, and that's where my questions come from. The latent class analysis is strongly data-driven, and yeah, that's how the procedures are. And in the end, this may form sometimes a limitation to interpretation of the results. I think you answered that in that same direction already in previous questions. And from my field of research, we really want to start from a theoretical approach and then also do the analysis based on this theoretical approach. In your conclusions on page 163, you describe also that fitting these FFM models needs to have a balance between two approaches, statistical approaches, but also insights or the art of model building, which requires insight from domain-specific knowledge, practice insights, and theoretical rigor. So my question is to you is, can you explain more how theoretical insights from the practice or the domain-specific field can help in improving these approaches or help in guiding how what these trajectories can look like?
Okay. Thank you, esteemed opponent, for your question and for your congratulations. In this case, I would argue that statisticians shouldn't just run these models in isolation. It's important to have some practitioner involved as well. And as we've demonstrated, if you just follow the statistics, you can be misled along the way. So with a theoretical grounding and approach, and someone who has specific domain knowledge in the field can narrow down the number of classes that we could possibly be considering, right? And as I've said as well, and you've mentioned that this is a data-driven process. So with the theoretical knowledge and domain knowledge of the practitioners, one can somehow validate the existence of these classes. So I would recommend that both statistician and practitioner sit down, go through these models, talk about the theoretical underpinnings behind the data, looking at how many classes we would expect or from our own experience, and use that somehow to inform the model selection process. So it shouldn't just be a statistically driven process. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And when do you think that collaboration should start? From where in the process of starting a study? Do you already have to sit together and to design the entire study to have a better application of this approach? Or?
Yes, well, as my colleagues would argue, it's always appropriate to first come to the statistician before conducting any type of research or setting up a study. So I would tend to agree with them. Let's sit down, see what we want to try and achieve with the data and what the data can tell us, and that can somehow inform the process that we will jointly follow. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your answer, because I think from our field of research, we also would like to do that. It's not to say that we always do that, start sitting with statisticians beforehand, but I think that, yeah, that can probably improve this type of applications in our field as well. Then I have another question, because you also mentioned that this latent class analysis, these models, it's quite novel, it's popular, it's used a lot. But are there also situations in which you really would say, do not use this? And what situations or applications could that be?
Thank you for the question. Yes, that is a tricky one.
It was not meant to be a kind of trick question,
well,
but
well,
it's just some because of this
think,
popularity. Then you always see it's used a lot, but maybe also misused.
Yeah.
So practitioners can also use recommendations
when
towards in this case, do not use it.
Yes, so yes, one can have a deep conversation about that, specifically when to use, when not to use. But at the end of the day, the use of these models is driven by your research question. Are you interested in seeing whether there are individuals or clusters of individuals following similar development over time? And if there's enough heterogeneity in your data specifically to allow for this, then that is the perfect case to apply. And as I've mentioned in the thesis as well, looking at the spaghetti plot firstly, it can help us inform what the polynomial order of the trend should be, and secondly as well, to see if there is enough variability in this data to apply the models.
Okay, thank you. I think I read the sign of the pro-rector, so thank you for your answers, and I give the word back.
Thank you, Dr. Unema. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Van Belle. She is Associate Professor in Methodology and Statistics at Maastricht University. Dr. Van Belle.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. So, dear candidate, I've read your thesis with great interest. It's a huge amount of work that you have achieved there. And I think that you succeeded in finding a balance between the technicalities and the recommendations to practical recommendations, and you made the results accessible to a great audience. So congratulations to you and to your supervisors. Of course, I do have a few questions, and I will start with a rather general question. So in chapter 1, you explained that you will review the most popular mixture models, and then in chapter 2, you restrict yourself to the most used techniques. And in chapter 3, then the classification statistics are not longer considered, except the scaled entropy, if I have read your thesis carefully. And then I fully understand that in one thesis, it is not possible to cover everything, and you already cover quite a lot. But I have the impression that one selection criterion to be included in your thesis is to be popular. Yeah? And so I would like to elaborate with you a little bit on that point, because I'm wondering whether by doing that you are not contributing to the fact that this technique will remain the most popular technique at the end, despite maybe some other techniques that possess better statistical properties.
Okay. Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for your questions and for your congratulations. This is indeed a question that we have addressed extensively in our teams over time, and popularity. The one specific motivation throughout this thesis was to make these techniques more accessible to practitioners. And the specific techniques that practitioners are using are the models specifically that I've spoken about in my thesis. So I wanted practitioners to have a good grounding and background knowledge of these models, and not just to apply them blindly in their research, to have an appreciation of these specific models. In terms of the fit statistics, where we trimmed a little bit down towards the end, I did indeed always include a few selections which weren't really included in the body of the text, but what we saw throughout our simulations is that on average, the Bayesian information criterion performed quite well. So that was the motivation for the specific focus on the big fit statistic.
So basically, you based also your selection criterion on available software or things that were available which I fully understand.
Yes.
And did you had some clues that some techniques that were not implemented had better statistical properties, even if they were more difficult to apply, or?
Well, if we speak about difficulty in the terms of more complex models, specifically such as growth mixture models versus GBTM or CPGMM versus the normal GBTM as an example, we saw that they did have a tendency to slightly perform better under certain conditions, of course, but didn't always perform better. And my argument as well is that if you run a GMM or an MCP GMM, this is a lot of more complexity that you've added to the model. And I specifically spoke about how the models struggled to converge to a specific solution where I had to just keep on increasing the random starts to have something sensible from the model. So my argument is, if you can avoid the additional complexity when a specific model can do, why not? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for your answer. I have another question. I have time? Yeah. I will ask one of your paranymph to read proposition 6.
The existence of true hidden classes is as much mathematical and a practical issue as it is a philosophical one.
So my question to that is, in what hidden class would you classify yourself as a statistician?
Between the mathematical, the practical, or the philosophical?
You can interpret the question as you want. Because
well, these are probabilistic models, so I would have a certain probability to be assigned to all three.
Good answer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. van Belle. The opposition will be continued by Professor Zegers. He is Professor of Complex Genetics and Epidemiology at Maastricht University. Professor Zegers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prorector. Very interesting thesis. It's nice to read real science again, see mathematics, statistics. When you talk about probability, I think probability is even more important nowadays. When I was reading your proposition 8, that a basic understanding of the backyard is required. I thought that people just need to understand statistics, that everybody needs to understand this backyard. And so I agree to that proposition, although we now understand that you meant it differently. Also, congratulations to the supervisors. I think is a fantastic piece of work. I have, when I read it for the first time, the thesis, I didn't understand this. I learned a lot from reading it and also your presentation. And I was looking for some kind of classification of these different models, and I found it on page 15. It was also in your presentation, the lay presentation. And I was wondering, basically, you have two decision points. The number of latent classes, which is more than one. This is what the thesis is about. And then random and not random. And I think shouldn't it not always be random? Because you can ignore heterogeneity or you can model heterogeneity. So why not just model it? And so why this thesis is not always a GMM model?
Okay. Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for your question and for your congratulations. Yes, this has been a constant debate throughout our all trajectories per se. And people would argue that GBTM is a far simpler model than GMM, but I think there are two very different approaches to handling the same issue at the end of the day. And with GMM, and specifically GMM will address questions of subject-specific questions. And in our research and in most applied applications of these models, it's more about the group differences, looking at differences in trajectory development over time. So in that case, both are useful, they have their own role, but GMM is a little bit more complicated, and my whole argument is that if you do not need to introduce this complexity, stay away.
But could you not also argue that if the models are different, then you have to use a GMM, and if they're the same, it doesn't matter, so you can also use a GMM?
Okay, well, yes. So with the GMM, we see that there's a lot of convergence issues in these specific models, and it's very specific to the data conditions. So if there's quite a bit of perhaps missing data, these models struggle to converge relative to a GBTM.
So to rephrase what you say is, and so basically, yes, we should actually always use a GMM, but sometimes the data is just not good enough, and then we have to use something more simple.
Well, not necessarily, because practitioners also do not have in most cases, software which is capable of running GMM. And in that case, the GBTM does quite a good job. And as we've demonstrated through this thesis, there are ways in which we can control for the spurious extraction of classes, and we can still get meaningful results from a GBTM analysis.
Okay. And another question is later in your thesis, you look at these multiple outcomes, and I was trying to understand, because I can understand scenarios where this is very useful. And I was thinking, for example, child development, and we have one outcome is IQ, the other outcome is shoe size. I'm trying to find something that's not related. And why would you do multiple outcomes and see whether you find different classes for outcomes that are not related? So if you add more outcomes, yes, of course, your model has more data to play with, but maybe you get classes that do not make sense anymore.
Yeah. Well, thank you. But that's why I always argue that it's a balance between the science and the theory, and let the theory also guide and logic the type of models that you're fitting. So in that case, fitting an individual that has, well, just their shoe size doesn't make sense to include in the model. So it's not just the statistics, throw the cat in the kitchen sink at the model, but be considerate and practical and pragmatic about which outcomes you're including.
Yeah, because I can also argue maybe the other way around. If you say shoe size and length, and they are correlated, so maybe they are even a proxy from each other. So could you not also argue that let's first try to simplify that maybe a univariate model is actually better, because or they are different and then they don't make sense, or they are the same, and then maybe you can unify them and do a univariate model.
Yeah. Well, that's also specifically motivated by your research question too. So if you're interested in seeing how each outcome develops in isolation, then univariate is good. But if you're specifically wanting to see the co-development and co-occurrency of outcomes in the data and the trajectories, then the multivariate is a natural starting point. But
okay.
Well, not a natural starting point. I would always argue that a univariate analysis is a first good start, and then once we've done some further analysis there, take the next step to the multivariate analysis.
Thank you. I have another question, and maybe it's a bit more philosophical as well as your proposition 6. So I'm thinking of the future of statistics and the future of data sets that we will have. Professor Zwakhaler was already mentioning the Swiss cheese and pragmatic trials, and so I can imagine that in the future we'll have lots of data, maybe even the end of the sample, and but not high quality data. So how do you see the field of statistics developing? So in other words, are we developing methods that are theoretically fantastic, but in real life will not be used anymore?
Yeah, so yes, statistics is an applied mathematical field, of course. So I would argue that we would see a lot of more interesting practical solutions to real world problems, and this is the way that statistics goes. And specifically with data science, as we've seen now, and AI, and the advent of big data, and specifically taking this big data and making something meaningful of it. You have various algorithms where you can select specifics from the big data, and data reduction techniques. So I would argue that the future of statistics is bright. We will see it still as a practical science to address real world issues.
Now, I learned in our pre-discussion, and I want to ask the question immediately because maybe we're getting harassed in a minute, is that you also teach statistics. And given these new developments in the field and the data sets, what do you think that our students need to learn more than what they're learning now here at our university?
Mr. van der Nest, I'm quite sure that you have noticed that the time for defending your thesis has passed. The committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and in particular the quality of your defense, and please await our return with the result.
Thank you.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Southside, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. Southside, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Mr. van der Nest. The degree committee here present, in the aula here, but also online, has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And in view of its positive verdict, and of course taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor van Breukelen is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom and law. And I invite your supervisor now to take the floor. Professor van Breukelen.
Thank you. Before doing so, Gavin, let me first thank our external opponents, Professors Nagin and Professor van der Schoot, for being with us here, for assessing your thesis and contributing to this ceremony. Thank you. It's much appreciated. Dear candidate, do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By virtue of the authority vested on us by the law, in accordance with the decision of the Defense Committee here present today, I hereby grant you, Gavin van der Nest, the degree of doctor with all the rights and duties associated with this by law and custom. As evidence thereof, I give you the degree certificate signed by the Rector, Secretary and other members of the Defense Committee and bearing the Great Seal of the University. Well, there's always a laudatio to end with. The laudatio will be given by that supervisor who is most deserving of doing that.
Dear Gavin, Dr. van der Nest, forgive me, right? I have been told the laudatio should last for 6 minutes. I'm afraid you have to bear with me a little bit longer, right? You have made us all proud today. Your parents, Mom, Zanda, Dad, Grandpa, or Grandma, sorry, what happened to me, right? Will burst any moment. And my pride also, I have to add. Though, let's get to the fun, boozy part of the day, SAP, to contain or give free rein to the heightened spirits. Take a peek. The booze may be also needed to drown the Brazilian-Dutch World Cup frustration. Sorry, Bjorn. But before that, it's my utmost pleasure to close this beautiful ceremony with a few final words. A brief admonition at this stage is required. For those here present, beware that I am neither constrained by the Dutch rules of engagement nor by the renowned, also Dutch, subdued civility and modesty. It's show time. Or I have to say, it's show off time. It's time to brag, and brag I will. Let's start by taking a wee trip back down to my rather selective memory lane. I recall some bits and pieces of your interview for the PhD vacancy. Gerhard, Matt, and I went into it with some expectation, as we are all already impressed by your CV, showing outstanding academic performance as well as real-world experience. The fact that you are coming from the econometric corner never worried us, although I myself, as you well know, have reservation about the School of Applied Statistics. You were calm, composed, and handled our questions with your usual panache. I particularly remember your answer to Gerhard's questions on why you'd like to have this job. Where am I? Your answer was broadly along the following lines, if I recall properly. After some time spent in the industries, you are becoming increasingly aware that you may be better suited to an academic researching environment. Not only was that your opinion, but it seems also of your family and friends. My thoughts at the time were, is he may be thinking that the life he's about to embark is one for inquisitive, curious, restless minds working towards honorable objective of unraveling the mysteries of life in pursuit of the truth. Oh, little you knew that PhD research years are usually the most miserable in anybody's professional path. How could I have omitted that from you then? Well, we wanted you after all, and to our satisfaction, you accepted the job offer. After your arrival, it did not take long for you to notice that life in research is never easy. Gratifying moments are more the exception than the rule. And overall, a researcher's way of living is not for the faint-hearted. To well convey its essence, I'm used to quote a dialogue in Shakespeare in Love. It's a movie. It's about the theater business, but please use that as research business, right? One guy says, allow me to explain the research business. The natural condition is one of insurmountable obstacles on the road to imminent disaster. So, what do? Nothing. Strangely enough, it all turns well. How? I don't know. It's a mystery. And your trajectory here, dear Gavin, has been no different. In the first year, you came across tough obstacles to surmount. You had to deal with a new complex topic. The setting you were embedded in was in a state of disarray in terms of available approaches, different software packages and their distinct modeling capabilities, not to mention an utterly disordered nomenclature. And it was in this unsavory environment that you were expected to write a literature review that was extensive yet condensed, technical yet digestible, and that while adjusting to a new culture and a way of living. Lastly, let's not forget, of course, a supervising team you had to get used to, a team that was in disagreement in all matters possible. Here, your gentleman manners and diplomatic skills came in very handy. And in this regard, the three of us are in no discordance. Math thinks, and I paraphrase, that you are able to integrate ideas from different supervisors in an elegant and efficient way. Quite an accomplishment. Gerhard does not deviate much from such judgment, characterizing you as a hard worker who takes feedback to heart and is very independent. I could not agree more. In fact, I have repeatedly told you that you take our suggestions and advice and elevate to much higher levels, making them your own. Like a culinary master chef, you take the simplest dish, simplest everyday boring food, and make it a 5 Michelin stars dish. And so it is that after few internal tug wars and many manuscript versions, the first paper was at last published in an applied journal, Advancing Life Course Research. Let's have a closer look at the article stats. Since its publication in 2020, this article has amassed over 90 citations and remains, to this day, one of the most downloaded and top-cited articles in the journal. Noticeably, it was also shortlisted. I think most people don't know that, right? It was also shortlisted for the 2020 Young Scholar Award of the same journal. I have not heard of any similar achievement ever before in the history of our modest department. Not too shabby, right? Reaching such pleasant summits have injected you with some much required boost and motivation, yet research waters remain difficult to tread. You jump heads in first in programming, coding required for the extensive simulations of all other papers. A second one was soon published, and we now have 2 more on the pipeline. The reason for the delayed submission being your current heavy load in teaching. Back to simulations. Part of your job consisted in learning and handling new statistical software packages. To say you had a sharp learning curve is a gross understatement. In no time, you became master and commander. You turned out to be such a wizard that even in the courses you attended to learn something, you ended up tutoring the other researchers, students, if not the teachers themselves, on how to handle the software at stake. Here again, your programming skills never cease to amaze your supervising team. When it comes to the gargantuan coding efforts weighing on your shoulders, an incident happened that was reason for much laughter among us. I don't know if you remember that, right? One day, by entering Gavin's office, I saw the screen of his computer running at very high speed. I could see it was working on the simulations. Simultaneously, I heard a very loud, metallic, clickety-clackety noise as if something was about to break. I exclaimed, "OMG, what is happening to your computer?" Your reaction, bursting into laughter, was, "Valeria, it is the coffee machine," which happened to be making the daily dose of PhD's favorite poison in the background. This is just an example of the mischievous associative powers of mind, which in my case could not help but to link the rumbling noise to the heavy simulation work I was aware that you were doing. You have been incredibly busy in the last 4 years, on the top of dealing with the research commitments and writings outside academia. It did not take long for us to realize your teaching potential. Given the widespread paucity of good educating human material in our area of expertise, no time was lost. You are soon engaged in several teaching duties. I am not expressing only my own assessment here, but also from good, reliable sources, lecturers, course and module coordinators, and students alike. They are more than happy to help you on the teaching leading role, which you fulfill with a caring, measured, yet passionate attitude. And in this note, the one that brings to the fore your politeness, kindness, modesty, intelligence, collegiality, again, not only my words, but also of your supervisors, I close this laudation. For that, I want to go back to your view of me as a protector that you expressed in the acknowledgement. To be honest, I never saw myself in this light, having been, without a shred of a doubt, one of the sources of your grief during these years. Yet, having a young adult son myself, who is happy to be there, right? I can see the point of projecting some motherly instincts onto you. I can also see the parallels between the two of you in your ways of being. For this reason, I asked him, my son, whether he would mind my reading to you a poem I once read to him that well captures how I see my role in his life. Yes, he said gladly. So for today, on a borrowing condition, this is the poem from me to you. Mom, please don't cry, right? It's called A Gentle Soul by Nicole Lucas. I must protect this gentle soul because the world has little peace. On many hearts it takes its toll, but gentle souls can all pain cease. I must protect this gentle soul, for it has proven a unique gift, not just for self, but others too, providing some much needed lift. I must protect this gentle soul, so when I hear love make its call, so it can remain pure and whole, my heart must not so quickly fall. I must protect this gentle soul, hidden within this human frame. Once free, will appear as pure as gold, shining brightly with no shame. To your bright future, dear Gavin.
Thank you.
Esteemed Dr. van der Nest, dear Gavin, it's my great pleasure to congratulate you with your doctorate, and I do that also on behalf of Maastricht University. And maybe I may share some impressions of the committee with you. We have enjoyed your presented summary, and it helped us as well to understand your work even better. That means that we not all understood your thesis directly. Your thesis was well structured, and we have seen a very valuable thesis and excellent work. And it showed quite a number of technical skills and details, and suggestions also to other researchers. And in your defense, we saw that you were indeed bridging the gap between data-driven studies and people and practical applications and people. And also, we are aware of the fact that the topic of your study was rather complicated and not easy to study. And in the end, we are very well satisfied with your defense. And I would like to congratulate not only you, but also you two Paralympics, but in particular also your supervising team, Professor Van Breukelen, Dr. Kandel, and Dr. Lima Passos. Congratulations with the result that we have seen today in a form of an excellent thesis and a very good defense. And of course, I also want to include in my congratulations your family, your parents, your partner, and other members of the family. Congratulations what we have seen today, and I hope that you have enjoyed it and also understood it. I also include in my congratulations your colleagues and friends, and all those who have contributed to your studies, because I think that quite a lot of people were involved. So congratulations to you all. And I would like also to thank the members of both the assessment committee and of this degree committee. We appreciate, Maastricht University appreciates the input of not only opponents and those who have read the thesis with great interest and critically. And in particular, I would like to thank the external members, and two of them are online. And I would like to invite our online opponents to congratulate the young doctor. And don't forget to switch on your microphone.
Maybe I'll start. Gavin, this is Daniel Nagan. I want to, again, as I said in my comments to you during the defense, this is really a first-rate thesis, and it marks a great beginning to your career. And I wish you the best in the years to come. You should take great pride in your work.
Yes, Professor van der Schot.
Yeah, sorry. I want to congratulate you, and I think your family in South Africa and all your relatives can be extremely proud of your accomplishment. Well done. We gained a new statistician who can build a bridge between highly complicated models and what clinicians need. So, welcome.
Thank you very much for your congratulations. I have one announcement to make. We will make, when we have completed this academic session, we will make a picture here in the aula. And I would like to ask you in here, the public, to stay on your places, so don't leave the aula. We will make, after making the picture here, we will go to the hall, and on the stairs there we will make another picture with the committee, but also with your close family with us. So we take here pictures and there pictures. And Then the beadle will show where to go after the session, because I have understood that the reception is not in this building. It's somewhere else. Hereby, I close this academic ceremony.
Do you want to do it yourself?
Thank you.
You can also hold it yourself.
You can hold it for me. Thank you. Thank you.
We will gather around you. Please come over here.